Despite Eileen's valiant efforts, we do not have a speaker on the First Amendment issues this morning, and so our entire day will be devoted to the work group discussion. Dory, with your input, well, at least with input from some of you, has put together a matrix that we thought would help us start working through the different questions to see where we are going. And because Dory took the laboring oar in putting this together, I thought I would have her walk through sort of her vision of how this will play out. A smaller version was sent out with the materials. We had large versions made, so if the work group members wanted to annotate or make notes, that would be possible, we're hoping. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dory and all of you and me.
So you recall at the outset of the work group, we talked about that we would be seeing and hearing presentations from a number of subject matter experts, individuals coming before you to make presentations on one topic or another that is relevant to the work of the work group. And then we would enter a phase where you needed to discuss amongst yourselves what you thought about the issues that we were confronting and whether any changes are advisable, and if so, what changes. Ultimately with an eye toward distilling whatever recommendations you have to written recommendations for the court to consider. So in our recent meetings, we talked about that there had been some ideas discussed, but perhaps we could all benefit from having a matrix of the sort that I prepared to kind of frame or guide the discussions. So I put some words on the page and circulated amongst you to see if it was helpful, and or if you had other either suggestions that you wanted to explore as ideas or dimensions that we should analyze. So what we have in column A are various considerations that we probably should discuss with respect to any given potential recommendation. The columns going, and thank you, Rex, for putting up the spreadsheet on the screens. It's the same one that you're looking at in hard copy. I figure I can make live edits to kind of capture any comments that you might have, and we'll go from there. The blue columns B, C, and D represent some overall structural decision that could be a recommendation to the court. And then as we get further to the right, columns E and subsequent are more a la carte options that could be recommendations that you would make consistent with any of the other changes or in addition to any of the other changes, just kind of as an individual or isolated recommendation that you'd make as well. So I know that I circulated it, but I would ask at this point, are there additional either dimensions that you feel like we need to add to column A, or are there options that you've been thinking about that you'd like me to put on the spreadsheet as columns right now? It's not a one and done opportunity. Of course, as we go along and you have ideas, we can populate them further, but I wanted to make that invitation now. Okay. So with that, I'll start to explain, since these are very succinct descriptions on the spreadsheet, I'll walk through what was intended in terms of the concept for discussion. I'll start with column A. We know that... For 1 minute, just to say that Andrea Jarman, a work group member, has been able to join us, and we're very happy to have her with us. Good morning. So consistent with the charter for the work group, we needed to discuss and explore some antitrust considerations. There have been some Supreme Court decisions that beg the question whether there are any changes advisable for the structure of the work group. Specifically, we heard from the Federal Trade Commission how a self-regulating profession like the practice of law is in jeopardy of some allegations related to anti-competitive liability or anti-competitive practices unless some caveats or structural infrastructure are in place. So that's what you see in cell A14 here, is the particular option that we'd be exploring in jeopardy of triggering anti-competitive practice liability. And even when you're in jeopardy of anti-competitive practice liability, there is a state action doctrine that can give you some defensibility around that, provided that you've structured it appropriately. have a clear state policy, and then active oversight by a state actor. So that's what's meant in cell A15. The next consideration has to do with, above that, cell A9, has to do with the First Amendment considerations that the work group is tasked with examining. Specifically, we know that in the Janus decision, an issue was framed, at least with respect to public sector unions, about compelled speech concerns. And if that is a concern that exists, we should then perhaps discuss what mitigation, if any, we would want to explore as a state for the bar structure. A second concern, not necessarily squarely framed in the Janus decision, is one concerning compelled association. And Eileen was doing yeoman's work over the weekend to try to secure a First Amendment practitioner who might be able to speak specifically to the issue of compelled association. Eileen?
Yes, I spoke with Eric Stahl at Davis Wright Tremaine, and then the ACLU. And the ACLU, they can't hear me? Oh, well. Will offer comments, and Mr. Stahl, although this is not his specific area, has also said he would take a look at it. But both, and I'm trying to pull it up now, asked to see the pleadings on remand in Fleck v. Wetched, and Dory was able to secure those, and I would encourage everyone. There are a lot of pleadings and lots of amicus, but I would encourage everyone to read the Fleck brief, because I think it's an issue we have to show that we're prepared to address, because it clearly just says mandatory bar associations, in Mr. Fleck's opinion, are not permitted under the decision in Janus. So I think that is an issue until there is some clarity from the U.S. Supreme Court that will be presented here.
Okay. So with respect to any of the structural or individual recommendations, we'd kind of explore what that looked like. Then we would discuss that with respect to a particular recommendation, do we perceive that legislative change would be required, rule change? There may be some significant financial considerations that should at least inform an implementation strategy, if nothing else. There may be consequences to access to justice, and we'd want to understand what those were and what mitigation was available. There may be consequence to minority injustice issues, consequence for individual sections of the bar. There's always ever worthy question, the degree to which it protects the public. That is, we can all agree, one of the primary reasons that we would regulate a profession, particularly the practice of law. And secondarily, does it improve the profession, or to what degree, perhaps, is what we'd be trying to capture here, to the extent that some of you have discussed amongst yourselves that certain of the cases seem to afford two opportunities to compel a regulated profession. One is that it's legitimately germane to the public safety and or consumer protection interest that you're trying to regulate for, or legitimately improves the profession. So to the extent that you feel as though that opens a door to an opportunity, we'd want to discuss that. Does the option alone address the First Amendment or antitrust issues, or is something more needed? And then I believe it was Hunter posed some generational considerations for us and reminded us that we always ever should be forward-thinking and strategic in how we examine the topics before us. So this question that you see in A35 has to do with giving some thought to that. Next question is considerations in favor of this option, considerations against this option. There may be something unique about one of the options that we explored that was not reflected in any of the questions or dimensions that I discussed before, so we'd want to capture that. And then are there any cautions or caveats? If one of these becomes a recommendation to the court, is there kind of a condition that you'd want to advise the court about? Go down this path, but do it this way, or be strategic in some way. So we'd capture that there. And then ultimately, we are doing all of this analysis to examine whether this group feels like any one of these columns is worthy of developing further into a recommendation to the court. They're, again, very succinct descriptions and the column headers, and so we'd need to flesh it out a little bit more and say, okay, what does that look like, and with what parameters would we make this as a recommendation to the court? Again, going to column B. Column B is the idea that we would make no changes, and that would be the recommendation from this group to the court, that for whatever reason or for a list of reasons that you come up with, that it's most advisable that the court not do anything. Option C is again one of the blue columns, represents kind of an overall structural adjustment. This would be splitting the functions of the bar in a very kind of narrowly defined way around the regulatory functions, so that what is mandatory for a license fee is whatever is legitimately paying for admissions, discipline, licensure related functions. Again, with a very narrow definition of what that would look like. Column D is something we've discussed a little bit like a hybrid model, and this one might involve some split or some bifurcation of the functions of the bar currently, but with a broader definition of what was going to be mandatory, inclusive of things that you felt improved the profession, but maybe related a little bit more attenuated in a little more attenuated fashion to strictly regulatory. And you can discuss what kinds of things that might include. Then finally, columns E and right are individual recommendations that one or the other of you have kind of offered up or suggested for consideration. I heard it suggested that maybe we convert to a Keller opt-in option. That's what you see in column E. A Keller calculation rule. One among you suggested that maybe there should be an independently audited review of what goes into the Keller deduction, kind of with an expectation that it be more expansively considered. A suggestion was made to revise GR 12 to clearly articulate a state policy and specify what the court's active supervision is going to look like. You now, mindful of things like Mid-Cal, could help the court understand what might be advisable to put into GR 12 to ensure state action doctrine protection. And then column H is the suggestion to explicitly address the court's rule in the rules of professional conduct in order to try to avoid antitrust liability, to the extent that those rules kind of frame what is ethical practice for an attorney and therefore have the ability to exclude individuals from the profession. If you have market actors involved in doing that, you want to have been mindful of just exactly whom they're including or excluding by framing ethical conduct in the definitions there. So that's that concept. So with that, is there any particular place that someone in the group would like to suggest we discuss?
Eileen.
Actually, I should have spoken sooner. I think there is one other area that we would need to think about the process for, and that's CLE approval, since that's a requirement of being a member of the bar, but it is also speech. So how that will be regulated for quality is also, I think, going to be an issue.
I think as we go through this, there'll be a lot of things where we will have to go deep after we get sort of the big concepts of what we think does or doesn't sort of legally pass muster. We have CLE approval, but we also have the CLE production side of it. Up to this point, we've pretty much focused on the clearly, I guess what I'd say the clear areas are the ones that seem most pertinent, but there will be a long list. But I think since it does implicate speech, we should add it now to the bottom of the left line, correct?
I edited it as column H.
Oh, you went to H, okay. That's why Dory's in charge. All righty. Others? Fred?
Dory, thank you for putting this all together. And one of your comments was, when I looked at this, I think I felt the same way, that there's dimensions. And the last two and I don't have the ABCs on mine, but the last two on the right, I guess now the second to the last two, talk about the Supreme Court's role in this. And in my research on the antitrust pieces, and I think dealing with dimensions, not changing these columns, but to discuss the Supreme Court's role in supervision of the WSBA, the questions of whether it's an advisory board, the BOG, or whether it's a standalone entity. I think that raises or it deals with lots of antitrust issues. I think those two columns here kind of touch on it, but don't specifically have that included.
Would you suggest adding role of, / role of BOG after the revised GR12, or just have it be its own column?
I think we don't need another column. I think that
Okay.
does it.
All right, thank you. Others? Yes, Kyle.
And Dory, thanks from me too, because this is very helpful. The way, and I mentioned opt-in under the Keller approach last time, and I'm still trying to make sense of that in my mind and figure out how that might work. When I look at this, I kind of think that maybe a column E, F, G, and H, certain portions of each one of those might apply under that. And so these aren't envisioned as individual choices. It could be a mix and match. Is that right?
Absolutely. You could onboard one, some, or all, and you could do it consistent within a larger framework. These were just individual topics for discussion, some or none of which could be valuable.
Thank you.
And I think we also envision after these meetings, we'll go back and kind of rework it, depending on how the conversation is going, and sort of refine, kind of as we narrow in, or refine the columns, or try to either combine them or separate them as where the discussions take us. So this is just a opening attempt to organize our thinking so that we can methodically, or haphazardly, however we want to do it, work through it. But so we sort of at the end will have be sure that we've at least thought and considered the ones we already know for sure are on our plate, and then others that we want to put on as we go forward.
And if it helps facilitate your discussion, I can either add specific notes or comments in certain cells, or I can kind of dashboard this. If you feel like a particular option is very helpful with respect to the antitrust issues of market actors, then I can put a green light, I can color that cell green. If you have concerns that an option doesn't serve one dimension particularly well, I could put red to denote concern. And then we can kind of go down the overall option and assess what that means then to inform either caveats to making that as a recommendation, strategies for addressing what you've identified as concerning, or dissuading us from making that as a recommendation at all. If dashboard helps, then that's as I can do, or I can put individual comments if you feel strongly about them.
Yes, please, Andre.
So at the benefit of hindsight in looking at the film, because I wasn't able to attend the last two meetings, and one thing that struck me when a discussion was had about the process of how we're going to cull this information, and everyone had the opportunity to grab the mic, and it would appear as if a lot of the statements were just that. They were position statements regarding what I'm thinking of, and not necessarily the process itself. And so I want to be mindful to the charter when we move through this, because the charter was to review and assess the structure in light of the recent cases. And I think it's important to understand whether or not some of the bar lawyers that are here have addressed that, because I think that part of our exercise is not to necessarily reinvent the wheel, but look at the resources that are already out there, see if there are fixes that have occurred and whether those fixes pass muster, or I won't say release us from liability, but put us in a good space if some of these copycat cases from other jurisdictions come our way. The second part, in looking at some of the discussion, was the Keller option. I think that's a great idea, but the feasibility of that, I think, would need to be discussed with some of the people that would actually be looking to put that into motion. And before we begin a robust discussion about that, I would like to hear them as to whether or not that's a good or a bad idea, or feasible, right? Because I think all of these ideas are good, but the question becomes if we can bring them to fruition. The third point is, a lot of the comments that we've had from public members seem to suggest that, hey, there's some things that the bar engage in that I simply don't want to pay for. So that suggests to me that some of our members may want to a la carte. And I guess the threshold question is that possible? Maybe that speaks to the hybrid approach that we have on this checklist or on this matrix. And then the last is the additional responsibilities of the WSBA and the Supreme Court appointed boards. I'm on one of these boards. We met with the court this last week, and a lot of us are in limbo right now because of what's going on with this structures work group and the situation around the country. So I think the metric model is good, but as we approach some of these things, I think we would be remiss not to pull from regulatory counsel, maybe Mr. Inde as well, or Julie Shanklin, to say, hey, look, this is something we had discussed previously, and this was what we had come up with, just to kind of end around our discussions. So that's just an overall observation that I had, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you, Andre. Others? Mark?
Well, I've read all the cases now, as I think you have, and I've read the briefs in Fleck on remand, and because I had this article that I mentioned I'm doing for the King County Bar Journal, and not a single one of these cases, not one of them mentions antitrust. Okay, not one. So let's not try the other guy's lawsuit for the time being, right? If that issue is raised and if the Supreme Court shows interest in it, right now all we got is a freaking dental case about teeth whitening. And, we can go around this table, every single one of us will come up with more distinctions than we can count. So the here and the now, though, Fleck, the cases in Texas and so forth, it's compelled speech and compelled association. It brings into question who's, the regulatory authority, in our case, the Supreme Court. I think eventually, if the Supreme Court takes a case, you're going to look at the standard review. They're going to look at what Keller says are appropriate expenditures, and then the question becomes: how much deference do they give to the regulatory authority? In this case, our Supreme Court's collective judgment that diversity, minority and justice, and so forth are programs that fit within to the improve the quality of legal services, which the Supreme Court approved in Keller. So I don't think we should start chasing our tail too much on the antitrust. I think it was great to tee it up. It was very interesting, but none of these cases mention that argument.
Eileen. Thank you, Mark.
Well, to follow up on that, Dory and I talked about this matrix, and it was very helpful for me, but I actually came to, and I think this is that I'm not a First Amendment expert. I'm not prepared to say this would be good, this would be bad. And my thought was that there should be another approach, which the court may not like, but that we do prepare, that's the recommendation. And then we have decision points for the court on the various options that we see as possible. And I agree, primarily under Janus. I think the Sherman antitrust, what we've heard about how it's managed here for discipline and suspensions, that it could be beefed up a little, but really I think that the bar staff have done a pretty good job of being aware of the issues and trying to act within the confines of the law. But that under Janus, if you read the briefs, I personally, but the Supreme Court may disagree, don't think they're going to reduce admission to the bar to some sort of driver's license thing where you pass the bar and go in and take a number and wait for them to issue you a bar card. But it's certainly something that's being argued. And on the other hand, I think there are probably some pretty big issues in the variety and scope of the functions of our bar today. So we can't, I think, foretell the future, but what we could do is say to the court, ask for and get an assessment. If we go to this narrow structure, what is it going to cost and who's going to run it? Because if you don't have a bar association, is the activity going to be housed within the Supreme Court as a little wing? Is it going to be a standalone commission? Is it going to be launched into AOC, which already has, and then how will it be funded? Because as right at the first meeting, Hugh Spitzer said, once you kind of move it into the government, is it going to be going through an OFM process, or can we still do, I don't think it's called dues anymore, licensure fees? So that, and to look at that approach, what will it mean? And I think part of this decision point as the court engages in it would include also being fair or open with the state bar's obligors, the landlords, people who rented the copy machines, the employees, that this is the process we're going through. These are the implications of some of these. And we will be prepared, if there is a lawsuit here, to say to a court, we have begun this process. We think this should be enough until there's clarity from the Supreme Court. But some federal judge may disagree, but at least we could do that. And I think it would also help the court tell the legislature what it needs. Because as I understand it, since it's the biennium, when they come back in, it's Representative Stokesbury's bill that springs back to life, which is one that just ends the bar, gives the sections their dues. No?
My understanding is it would be the last one that
the
was done, so you would be all the way up to the striker. You don't go back to the beginning. It's where it was left at the end of the session. So they don't have to redo all that work, but it's still, it can spring back to life since it is the supplemental year.
Oh, well, that's better, though it still has the elected board and an entity. So that would give some guidance, I think, to the court. And I think you could go through the range of activities within the bar and have, excuse me, an assessment of what would be the implication if we went to a voluntary bar. I think feasibility, Ann Holmes at the last meeting spoke to me afterwards and said, if your funding source is purely voluntary, I am expanding on her comments, it's unpredictable. So how do you have reasonable financial stability in terms of funding the activities of the bar? So that would be my thought, is that rather than telling the court, you should do this, you should launch ATJ into the stratosphere, you should keep the sections, you should do whatever, is to go through and get an assessment and then to consider who will do it. Would it be the Board of Governors? Would it be a special master appointed by the court? Would it be the court itself? And again, to look at the implications of each of those. So that's where I came to after walking through this process with Dory. So.
Thank you, Eileen. Others? Paul?
Thank you. My approach, I think, would be different. I'm talking with I'm a liaison to a number of sections, and virtually every section expresses the same concern. We don't know if we'll be in existence next year. I think if you tell the court, that we should prepare to unwind or bifurcate or whatever and have this sitting in the silo to launch at any moment, everyone will be perpetually in a state of limbo. So I'm concerned about that. I would rather that this group make fairly clear recommendations to the court, and hopefully the court adopt those recommendations. I lean toward essentially sort of the no changes model, but with some of the, maybe converting Keller to an opt-in, just taking some steps, some best practices to forestall or prevent litigation. And then I think the better approach is, once we've done some things to take a position on avoiding and take some best practices to avoid issues that raise compelled political speech or compelled political association concerns, then we're in a posture to respond to litigation. And that litigation may then further clarify what is permissible and what is not permissible. And I think, to Mark's very good points, not try and argue the plaintiff's case for them, but in a sense to do what we think is necessary. I agree that antitrust is really not a huge issue, but there's some things we probably can do to make sure that it is not an issue. There are some things we can do to, avoid issues around compelled political speech. I really like the idea. I was talking with my colleague PJ earlier today, and he had a very good idea of having an outside auditor, and I see it on here, have an outside auditor handle the Keller deduction analysis for us so that it's objective and probably is going to result in a larger number. And then have that be opt-in. Just some preventative, proactive steps to address the issues that are raised in current litigation, the ones we think are the most problematic, and then hopefully we don't get sued. But if we do get sued, then maybe that is an opportunity to refine the model.
Thank you, Paul. Others? Please, Fred.
I agree with Paul. Much of what he said on this is that I think, again, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater by getting an independent auditor to review the Keller. Doesn't mean you necessarily change it much, but you make sure that you're doing the right thing. And wearing a litigator's hat, if I have to defend this free speech and show that we've been vigilant about, or the state, whether it's the Supreme Court, the BOG, the Bar Association, if we're vigilant in looking at those free speech issues, we're going to be able to defend against a lawsuit. I've read the Supreme Court decisions, and I don't think the last Supreme Court decision on free speech puts us in a position of doom. You go back and read the decisions 4 years before that were dealing just with, and the Supreme Court said bar associations are different. But we do have to be careful about these free speech issues, and there's things we can do. I'd love to hear from the Bar Association's staff whether the opt-in versus opt-out, that change is difficult to make. If it's not difficult to make and we have an independent auditor, boy, if I was litigating this, I'd have a lot of stuff to put in my brief. And we protect our institution. Thank you.
Others? Mark?
I think our First Amendment jeopardy comes into play. We would be in a position to be to have somebody find our programs more problematic the more we, let me say it more clearly, the more we attenuate our Supreme Court's control over our profession, the greater risk we have of a First Amendment challenge. And so I think, with respect to an outside auditor, if the outside auditor is given discretion to determine what programs fall within, the Keller, improve legal services and regulate the practice, I think that creates more jeopardy for us. I think we have to create a stronger connection between our Supreme Court as a regulatory authority and our Supreme Court's judgment with respect to what programs meet the Keller standard rather than weaken it. And that could that could weaken it. I like the idea of having somebody, look at what's been done to determine whether these programs are chargeable or not under Keller. But I think one thing we have to do during this process, and it's pretty good, but we have to strengthen our courts' control over the practice, and that I believe would be assistive in avoiding the kind of First Amendment jeopardy that we're talking about.
Thank you, Mark. Fred, and then Kyle.
Mark, I'm not sure that I'm saying something different than you, is that when I talk about this auditor, how it looks like, I'm really looking at this as coming from the Supreme Court. I mean, the Supreme Court does this. And, right now we have the WSBA, which is doing all this other stuff, is the one that's deciding, well, we did this and we did that. This piece fits into this category. This piece fits in that category. It's not the Supreme Court that's doing that analysis. And I just don't see that one of the 9 justices is going to go out there and do the auditing. But I could see the Supreme Court doing the auditing with the assistance, whether you call it a master or whether you ever do it. So I'm trying to figure out that this is the Supreme Court doing it, because I really believe what you stated, Mark, is this, that the Supreme Court needs to be involved in this. But as a practical piece, I just don't see on their busy docket that they're going to actually do it. So as one lawyer to another, I ask you, is there a way to get this other person, but that person is from the Supreme Court, whether it's not one of the 9, but it's one of their assistants or their master or their auditor, or whether it's some retired Supreme Court justice or somebody else that's doing the auditing?
Well, Kyle, I'm going to take cuts on your next in line, which I try not to do. I think there are a variety of ways that can do it. Oftentimes, the State Bar Association makes the assessment, and we review it and say yay or nay, which then gives it our imprimatur. If someone besides the Bar Association was actually determining the number or reviewing the number that the Bar Association came up with, which is what happens each year when we have challenges, not each year, but the last couple of years there have been challenges, then we get usually a judge or a retired judge to look at it and determine whether they think it's correct or not, or make any adjustment. And that's what Bill Downing did for us for the Supreme Court last year. And then based on his recommendation, that's what it becomes. So it would be a question, I think, and you're absolutely correct, that a justice is not in a position to determine what is the correct Keller deduction on their own without someone providing it to them. So in the first instance, that's not what I do not think that would be what we would be doing. Having the ultimate say and authority, I think, does give you the insulation. Anything we can have where the Supreme Court, that we think is really critical, that needs to have some Supreme Court more direct oversight, because arguably everything we're overseeing, but we don't interject ourselves into, then that would, I think, provide the insulation or the cover or the response to a challenge someone would make on that. So I think just in that description, there's like 3 or 4 different ways you could get there, but all of them would be money and speech, and the Supreme Court having some weigh in. So it could be the kind of the arbitrator that I pick now. I can pick anyone to do that. And we don't normally review that. Once, for example, when Judge Downing spoke, that was it. Our appointing him was what it was. Maybe we need to have it come back and have us do it. Or we would say, well, the bar does it. Instead of the bar just doing it and it being done and waiting for someone to object, we would review it and put a stamp of approval or a change on it. Or you could go, as we talked, to the opt-in, opt-out, and then you still would have to have some assessment, but even having the opt-in, opt-out already gives you a lot of insulation because there is no compelled speech. It would, at that point, it would become voluntary speech of the person opting in, I think. So those are my thoughts. I'm going to go to Kyle, then I'm going to go to Eileen, and then I'm going to go to Abel, and I'm going to try not to jump back in unless I think it's really pertinent.
Thank you. And your thoughts are consistent with mine, Your Honor.
Thank
the
you.
way
Still
I
Mary.
That's hard.
I know.
That's hard for me.
Still am.
So the way I've been thinking about this is the independent auditor would be checks and balances against the what the bar may start out with, and then the independent auditor would advise the Supreme Court. And if it was advising the Supreme Court, who would still have authority over it, Mark, would that change your opinion as to the placement of the auditor itself?
When asked a direct question, you may answer.
Uh,
Thank you.
well,
Thank
yeah,
you, Your Honor. You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that we should, forget about the auditor idea. I meant to imply that in every action that we take and every action we don't take, we have to, I think, assess whether it attenuates the Supreme Court's control over the practice of law, which is, I think, the critical function here. Because I do think at some point the U.S. Supreme Court is, if they do something, there is going to be a deference to the state court regulatory authority, the state court's judgment on what programs may or may not fall within Keller or whatever left. Another thing, besides the fact that none of these cases have raised an antitrust argument, there's not a single one of these cases, even this remarkably poor brief that the Texas Attorney General's office filed in support of the plaintiffs in the Texas case. None of them say the practice of law shouldn't be regulated. None of them say that. So, there's not going to be the driver's license thing. Nobody's going to throw out law school education. Nobody's going to throw out bar examinations. Nobody's going to throw out discipline. It's just not going to happen. And they don't even argue that in these cases. And some of them, the arguments are, some would say are a little bit out there, perhaps.
Eileen.
Well, I can sense my minority report, but the question for me is not whether the activities of the bar are worthwhile or important or valuable. The question is, will they survive Janus? And it's not just the compelled speech and the money. It's also association. And the hybrid model in Nebraska requires people to associate, even if dues are voluntary, to various bar association activities. And I think that is a huge issue. There is an argument, and again, I am not trying to put a comment on the value or the worth of any of these activities, but the question is, will it survive Janus? And I think there's certainly an argument that a number of the bar's activities, ATJ, and the animal rights section, just to take, there's certainly lawyers representing people who raise livestock who would have a difference of opinion with the animal rights section, water law, all of those sections. So I don't think we can just focus on the money, and I don't think we can be too blithe about the issue of requiring people to be associated with activities undertaken by the bar, even if they are not required to pay for them.
Abel Hunter.
Well, thank you. I think this might dovetail on some of Eileen's comments, but I also want to echo one of Paul's comments, which I think was encouraging us to give clear recommendations to the court, even if it is in the form of a majority or a majority and a minority opinion. I think it would be helpful if we are able to make clear recommendations to the court at the end of this process, because as has been stated by a number of people, we've done some homework on this now. We've spent a lot of time and effort, a lot of billable hours have been spent on this project, and there's some pretty smart people in this room. And so I think we can use that time and effort to get some good quality products to the court. I did want to give, I guess, kind of my thoughts on a big picture question here, and that is that it appears that we are rapidly coming, if not already at, the first big fork in the road for our group, and that is, do we recommend change or no change? And if we recommend change, what does that look like? And I want to address kind of my thoughts on that with my recommendation as to what fork we ultimately adopt. As part of that, I'm reminded of something that Chief Justice mentioned at our first group, and something I've been thinking about as well, is that we have an opportunity to think big here. We have a bar association. It's been around a long time. There is value in preserving old things. I do believe that. It has been around for a very long time. But it's also important for us to think about what is constitutionally permissible and what is the ideal bar association for our state at this point in the 21st century. And I want to echo the previous comments that have been made to Dory about the grid. This is extremely helpful. And then the Chief Justice, your clerk's analysis of the various bar association structures that are out there. I think it's been very helpful for me as I wade through these issues and think about what are other states doing when they wrestle with this question of what's appropriate for their state. But as I think about what's appropriate for Washington practitioners, our profession in 2019, here are some of the things I'm thinking about. It's clear we have a bunch of members of our bar who are very displeased with being captive members of this bar. And I think it's more than just those individuals who are not going to like being associated with the bar or any bar. I think it goes beyond that. I think there are a certain number of people who actually could be much stronger, more enthusiastic members of a voluntary bar organization or a local bar association. And I think we can remember that although we are an important part, a big brick in the wall of rule of law here in our state, we're not the only one. There's a bunch of voluntary bars that are out there. There are specialty bars that are out there. And if we were able to take a percentage of the members who currently belong to the WSBA that are displeased and convert them either to being not actively displeased or maybe even potentially enthusiastic members of a voluntary bar association, that would be a significant change for this organization, and I would argue even for the profession. I think it could have significant positive consequences for our operations as an institution, for the health of our profession, and it could lead to positive consequences for our relationship with the public as well. And I talked about early on how I think what we do really needs to be viewed through the lens of, is it going to build trust with the public? And if you've got a lot more happy attorneys, I think that are not going around saying, I'm captive in an organization I don't agree with, I don't like it, it's caused problems, they've taken positions I disagree with. But instead you have members who are going around saying, now I'm either not a displeased member or maybe even an enthusiastic member of a local bar association or a specialty bar association, and the statewide organization heard my concerns and adopted changes. I think that could be significant. One thing that I've also been struck with is, I think like everybody, I've been reading the public comments that have been coming in, and I've been trying to acknowledge them all, even with just a quick email, just saying, hey, read it, I promise you it didn't go into oblivion, it's being read and considered, thank you. There's broad consensus, I think, among everybody that what we need to do, regardless of whether we adopt change or no change, is ensure that the core functions of the bar are preserved, protected, and improved if possible. And I think it's telling that that a lot of our conversation seems to assume, and I think in a good way, that discipline is functioning well and that licensing is functioning well. I think that's a good sign. But I do think we need to make sure that we do focus on those issues as well. And I think even among those who are saying, look, I want out, I don't want to be in a mandatory bar association any longer, they're all saying there needs to be strong licensing, strong disciplinary functions. So I think that's important as well. And I guess kind of my last observation is that if we were to go to more of an a la carte model or some sort of a model wherein either we've got this mandatory voluntary split that is narrowly defined or more of a hybrid model, I think there is a potential for a potentially significant renaissance of voluntary bars and specialty bars. And I don't think we should overlook that. It could be significant and strong for the health of the profession. So with that, with our first kind of fork in the road coming up, I'd encourage us to think about taking the fork that says change. And we can talk about more, like at least in my mind, of what that would look like later on. But that's where I'm right now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call on myself, and then I'll call on Andre. You used the word mandatory, Hunter, but I think you really meant integrated, which is mandatory plus, with all the extra things, because you really wanted the regulatory. I think it's a mistake, I shouldn't say it's a mistake. I think it's important to remember that many of the state bar sections are very active and vibrant, and they themselves are almost like specialty bars. The Supreme Court had dinner with the litigation section executive committee that has been happening, an annual dinner for over 35 years. And their great concern is, as you mentioned, are we still going to be here or not be here in the future? And I would hate to lose that enthusiasm and that interest and involvement that we currently have if there's a way to have the sections in some sort of hybrid. or I would want to be able to launch them if it were to become sort of a voluntary bar, but on a statewide level, because many of the specialty bars, of course, are based on race or gender or sexual orientation, and the voluntary bars are based on geography by the counties. So that's sort of the structure that's the groups that are out there currently. And Washington Lawyers, is a statewide one. Other specialty bars are trying to become more statewide, but are really King County centric, or at least I-5 corridor centric. So I think as we're thinking about it, we don't want to lose those that are invested and engaged and caring deeply. Now some, perhaps the animal rights one, which I believe is our smallest one, although I think there's a piece one that might also be very small, they're probably not paying all of their freight. Just the amount that they have to pay into overhead probably wipes out what they, it doesn't wipe out, but doesn't leave them a lot to work with. Others, these giant ones, real property probate and trust, others that have many members and have construction law for many years, they're very robust. They have big accounts that they're worried about what's going to happen with their money. They're spending it down in case they don't continue to exist because of the uncertainty. And they play a really vital role, both in improving rules, in recommending legislation that tweaks things that need to be done, and just building the camaraderie within the bar of when attorneys on opposite sides can come together in that type of a gathering. And so those are a lot of the values that I think the sections provide. Now, if we were to kind of go to a mandatory voluntary, would the bigger sections be willing to underwrite some of the little sections, the smaller sections? Would they say, well, we have enough money and it's important to us to have this depth? We also have the young lawyers and we also have the senior lawyers. So we can't forget, and that's based on age and sort of one sort of starting out together and one is sort of ending their careers and having those connections and having their CLEs so they can continue. So I think it's as we're going forward, we have to think about the values and the benefits that are received and weigh that up against the legal and how we can mesh those or not mesh those going forward. But I think it's still possible, and especially if, I'm thinking more and more about the a la carte sort of opt-in, which is basically what it is now, because you pay extra for sections in the bar, don't you? Here, yeah, I know you do.
Correct.
I haven't been in a section for a lot of years. So it may just be where you keep, how you do the money, or how you do the overhead, or who has authority. And I could really see a board of governors still being really over the sections and over certain aspects, and the court with approval over the regulatory that makes that much more clean. Paul, I'm going to put you on the list, but I'm going to go to Andre next. And I also, after Paul, I would like anyone who hasn't spoken to think about if you would like to speak at this time, and I'll call on Dan on the phone because I want to be sure I'm hearing from all voices, okay? So, Andre, you're next.
Thank you. Couple of points following up on Hunter's comment. I think there's value in preserving old things. I haven't heard anyone offer that Washington is a leader in the industry, and I think we are. And I think that other states are watching as we're engaging in this process. And so another thing that I heard in reviewing the tape was nobody's really advocating to blow up the bar. So it sounds like we're considering an integrated model. But what that looks like is I guess, the race of what we're looking at. I think it's important to acknowledge, and the Chief just pointed this out, that the sections aren't self-sustaining. And so is there going to be an opportunity for underwriting, and who is the arbiter or the determining body that delves out the money? So it does come back to money somewhat. But I also think you can't make everyone happy. the squeaky wheel sometimes gets the oil, but sometimes it may rust. And so we're in an adversarial profession. We're in a hyper-polarized time within our politics right now. And I think preservation of old things and improving those old things are where I am. So, Chief, you didn't steal a lot of my remarks, but certainly with respect to the sections not being self-sustaining and them being a vibrant part of the bar, I think it's critically important. And my closing comment is in relation to revising GR 12. Now, GR 12 was amended recently to include some of the model ABA, I think it was Resolution 105. And so, again, we're looking at being a leader in the industry, adopting some of the ABA proposed guidance and resolutions. Are we trying to monkey with those? There's been a lot of thinking that has taken place for us to get there. And in 5 months, after there's been years of analysis, are we trying to undo those to fit in with a knee-jerk reaction to some of the Supreme Court cases that have come down? And so I just caution us, again, to have a fidelity to our mandate and not tinker with things that don't need to be tinkered with. And so that's all I got for now.
Paul, and then I have Dan Clark has sent an email message that we'll read for him. I have Paul, and then I have Dan Clark, who we have received an email message from. Paul.
Thank you. In response to Hunter's suggestions, I guess, regarding essentially sort of bifurcating, there would be some value in the sense that, lawyers who are currently upset, with having to join the Bar Association might be less vocal, might be appeased by that. But the impact to the sections, for example, I think would outweigh that, would be more significant. I think in any model where we've seen bifurcation, you see at least maybe a 30%, 20, 30, maybe even higher percent drop-off in participation. Being somewhat integrated and allowing for shared communications more easily and being under the same umbrella, I think has benefits for the entire what we call, the Integrated Bar Association currently. And so I guess I'd go back to saying that that's my preferred outcome. Regarding an opt-in and regarding a la carte, options, I think that's a very good idea. I think, again, the idea of bringing in an outside auditor to figure out exactly what the sections cost, I have have my own views about the allocations, the accounting conventions for allocating expenses to the sections. I've had concerns about those allocations for many years. This idea that the sections are supported or somehow subsidized by the members, I think is incorrect, and I would really want a robust, independent audit of what the sections bring in and what they cost. Mary, you indicated yourself that the larger sections are clearly profit centers, and some of the smaller ones do cost, maybe more and aren't able to carry their own weight. But I think in the big picture, the sections definitely carry their weight. There have been a lot of things that the sections have done over the years for which they've received absolutely no credit. All sales of online materials produced by the sections are just now in the near future, going to be credited to the sections. And I think there's just been an over-allocation of expenses to the sections that they don't really benefit from. It's just an accounting convention. And then they're trotted out as being subsidized by the members. So I think a la carte is a very good idea, but it would need to be supported by robust external auditing and accounting conventions.
Dory, will you read Dan's message, please, when you're done making your notes?
So, Chief, I was going to point out that a gentleman joining us remotely, Barnaby Zoll, pointed out these suggestions made by the ABA with respect to the antitrust considerations, and his assertion is that they frame specific steps that could be taken. This is written from the perspective of an antitrust lawyer. So I indicated that I would include this article in your reading materials for the next meeting. I don't have Dan's email, but I know Margaret does, and she can read it.
Oh, Margaret, would you please do that? Thank you.
This is an email from Dan Clark, and he says his comments for discussion would be the following. I agree with the comments from Paul, Fred, Mark, and others that it makes sense that we start with the current unified bar model and we look to make what changes to that which are
Could
necessary.
you read a little slower, Margaret?
Yes.
Thank you. Could you start over and read a little slower? I want to be sure I hear it all, and it takes me a second to absorb it.
Okay. I agree with comments from Paul, Fred, Mark, and others that it makes sense that we start with the current unified bar model and we look to make what changes to that are necessary. I think we need to come up with recommendations for the court and not leave Wsba staff and sections and members in limbo. I am proud of Wsba and the robust programs that we currently have. If we need to tweak, then let's do that. But bifurcation seems to be analogous to throwing out the baby with the bathwater and not something that I favor. So I favor trying to keep an integrated mandatory bar. If we are forced to change, then a hybrid would be my next choice, and a separate bifurcated bar would be my least desired model. For financial reasons, I think it makes sense that we keep the unified bar in place. To be respectful to Wsba employees, I think keeping as much, if not all, of the current structure also makes sense. It would be my strong belief that we should do so unless we are forced to bifurcate by court decision. If we make it non-mandatory, I believe there will be a dramatic financial reduction for programs. In speaking as District 4's governor, I believe that the farther away from Seattle you get, the more you will have members not wanting to opt into the optional bar as they just don't see a cost-benefit value. Additionally, as we heard from Nebraska, overall they suffered a 20% reduction in the non-mandatory bar ultimately after they bifurcated. As we've seen from the listening tour, the farther you get away from Seattle, the more that the general feeling is the bar is currently too Seattle-centered. So bifurcating, I believe, will cause loss of revenue and membership and harm to the public for access to justice and diversity. I think we should take the 4 columns to the left, the opt into Keller, making it more robust for a deduction, clarifying GR 12 that the court is in control and looking at least in the interim for having less controversial and politically charged articles in the Northwest Lawyer seem prudent. It may make sense to look to make payment for the Northwest Lawyer an opt-in option too. I think it makes sense to strengthen GR 12 and potentially include the Diversity Committee as a Supreme Court created board and clarify in GR 12 that access to justice and diversity and equity and inclusion principles are paramount and integrated into the practice of law and protection of the public. This would seem to also help with Janus litigations against Wsba. In conclusion, I do believe while we are talking about the structure of the bar, we should also talk about current structure and what can be improved, even if not required under Janus and or antitrust considerations. I hope that in future meetings, if we do decide to keep the mandatory integrated bar structure as a preferred model, excuse me, we'll look at various current bylaws and or practices that could potentially be improved for the benefit of Wsba as an organization.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Dan. Anyone who hasn't spoken who would like to weigh in at this time? Esperanza? Also, before you do that, Margaret, could you send Dan's email to the group at the end of the meeting? I took notes, but I thought it was a very thoughtful, comprehensive comment. I don't want to have missed it. Esperanza, please.
Thank you. I wasn't going to say anything. I was going to wait to the second half, but consistent to what I've been saying since I first spoke in this group. I think there's, I'm hearing the challenges of a bar that deals with money. And then we want to be a bar that addresses justice. And in reality, it seems like the two don't go hand in hand. And that it seems to me that it would require some kind of change about how how justice in a bar is thought about, and how it really has to be integrated into, let's see, I put it in here somewhere as I was hearing people talk, that having the whole concept of access to justice, for lack of a better word, be a requirement or a value that you can't take out of the bar. And that when we talk about the money or the financial side of a bar, that we have to figure out how to deal with the fact that the two don't seem to go together. They don't necessarily contradict each other, but they fight each other. And in the language that I've heard, and there have been some really good suggestions that I agree with. However, I think that if we have to make sure, I believe that we have to make sure, in order to protect the public, in order for attorneys across the state, whether they're in Seattle or in some small town in eastern Washington or southwest Washington, that every attorney, that's not going to happen today, but this is the future, that every attorney will have a sense of the ownership of access to justice. They will be able to see how it's connected to their practice wherever they're at in the state. So there's a lot of work to be done, but the main thing to me is the tension between the money and justice. So I'd like to see us kind of figure that out a little bit more.
Or Andrea first. Andrea, anything right now? Okay, Jane? Please, and I'll come to you, Fred.
I wasn't going to really say anything because I keep going back to my bottom line on this whole thing is I kind of feel the attorneys are being, I guess, somewhat, lack of a better word, immature because of the bar fees. When you look at any profession, they all have fees related. They all, I think probably to every profession, have people that are upset because they have to pay these fees, and yet they've all gone into the profession with their eyes open, knowing that in order to be a member of whatever profession you're in, you're going to have certain fees that you're going to have to pay in order to participate in that profession, to get more education, to make sure that you're the best person for the job in that profession. I kind of just checked around a little bit. Attorneys don't pay any more, really substantially any more money than a doctor would pay for their fees. And I'm sure doctors are screaming all the time about, having to pay this license fee, and they've got to pay all of these other fees and their student loans and everything else. I see that for me, from what I'm hearing, the people that are kind of doing the most screaming it comes down to money. They don't want to have to pay the money. They want to have all of the benefits of the organization, but they don't want to have to pay for it and pay into it. And yes, there are, I feel that it's very Seattle-oriented too. I mean, I would much rather be able to travel to Ellensburg for these meetings than having to come here for, if I'm on a committee, come into downtown Seattle, because I'm not used to the Seattle traffic. People that are here, you know, Hunter would much rather be able to walk here from his office than having to drive to Ellensburg, so that's going to make that significant difference. I do it because I think being on a committee like this is very important, and I think a lot of the attorneys out there feel the same way. You know, we're hearing from, like you said, I agree with practically everything Andre had said about, you know, the squeaky wheel, and sometimes they get the grease and sometimes they should rust. And I think we kind of need to keep that in mind, that I personally feel we're only hearing from maybe 1% of the Bar Association that has issues with the bar fees. I think everybody else I've talked to, yeah, it's high, but, you know, it's something I've got to do and something I've got to pay. And they've all said, but we do have some benefit from it. And so that part, I kind of hate hearing any more about it, because I just think you guys are just crybabies. You know, pay your dues. You're making, you know, even somebody making only $70 an hour, you know, that's probably what, 5-6 hours worth of work for your fees for the whole year. But I think some of the other stuff, yes, I think we really need to look at. But I guess I'm kind of in favor of less change is good, because this has been developing for years and years and years. And yes, it probably does need tweaking, but I don't think that there should be any major tweaks, because, you know, we might have the best intentions, but once you actually implement them, you're going to probably find a whole lot more problems than what you originally thought that were out there. So I think we should be cautious about doing any major changes.
Thank you, Jane. It's the public perspective, which is very important to have. And sort of your end thing, watch out for unintended consequences. You could create something new and then just create a whole new raft of issues. Fred, you're next. And then Dory, are you next?
There's an online
Oh, we have online, okay.
I don't think I can say it better than Jane and Esperanza. So to start with, I'll say I agree with you. Maybe I can put a little more flesh on the bones to what you've started with. I, too, read all the comments and saw a lot of people complaining about what things cost. And it's always legitimate to review costs and make sure that money is not wasted. But it reminds me of reading, it doesn't matter whether it's the newspaper in Spokane or Seattle or the Grays Harbor News. People complain about potholes, and then the next week they complain that they don't want to pay for the city engineers that are filling the potholes. Sometimes things cost money, and it'd be great if it was $100 to be able to do what we have to do, but I'm not sure that that's going to be possible. One thing that Jane said, and here's where I can put a little flesh on the bones. We voluntarily choose to be attorneys, those of us that are attorneys. And to do that, we take an oath of office, and we become part of one of the three branches of government. We take an oath to abide by the rules of professional conduct. If you look at the preamble to our rules of professional conduct, it makes it clear that the legal profession has a special responsibility for the quality of justice administered. That's what we have to do in this branch of government. And I believe that with respect to the Access to Justice Board and other things that maybe we pay a little bit of money for, I think we have to do that because the Access to Justice Board works to coordinate access to justice efforts. And as a legal profession, as lawyers, as voluntary members of this organization, we are guardians of the law and play a vital role in the preservation of society. And I guess I'm here because I'm the Access to Justice Board representative, but I also am here as an attorney and as a citizen. And I think, again, we have to be careful that we don't waste money. We have to be vigilant and make sure that our money is wisely spent. But we have to be mindful of our fundamental responsibilities.
Myself, and then we have an online. I think it is really important to recognize that we are stewards of justice. The year I was the bar president, that was my theme for the whole year, all my speeches. And bar column articles were about that. And I think we're also stewards of the finances and stewards of the trust that is placed in us as the leaders in the branch, the Board of Governors, the Supreme Court, to be sure that we're doing justice, but that we're also being responsible and respectful. And I think the bar has been in the area of finances, and I think when they didn't hold the referendum but didn't increase the prices because they decided they could do under other means, it wasn't intended that they would always stay at that very low amount and that they needed to come forward. And so I think really people get a very good return on their investment. We had some interest in, and we'll talk about it at the end of the meeting, hearing from the Department of Licensing or ones that license the doctors. I don't know that we necessarily need to, but it was an offer that was made. It's sort of like careful what you wish for, because you want to be run by a state government. They can be, and I don't think we do. The other thing I was going to say is I think any board that is a Supreme Court appointed board, presuming there's still some place to administer it when we're done, is safe, because you have that connection to the Supreme Court. And whether we have to define the practice of law to incorporate it, these sort of ones that aren't specifically within it, access to justice, race, equity, and inclusion, which are the two that we keep going back to, that are really the ones that are what I have been hearing in all of our meetings is that that's integral. And so we have to figure out a way to make that happen. We have a Minority and Justice Commission already on the Supreme Court, and the work that the Bar Association is doing is complementary but not the same. So does it become the same, or do you have, in essence, a bar? We have a Supreme Court administered Minority and Justice Commission, but would we at some point recommend having a bar administered race, equity, inclusion something that would encompass what the Diversity Committee and others are doing right now to try to do it? And of course, race, equity, and inclusion has become a major factor for the Access to Justice Board and for other boards, recognizing the role that that plays in our society and in our profession. And so I think there are ways to at least try to insulate those areas that we think are so important that we would do. Now, whether we have to do it at this time or do you do it when the Supreme Court comes down and says, unless you have these connections, you don't have these connections. I just put it out there, but I think part of our job will be to identify or solidify to the extent we can what are our core values that we have to have in a profession. And then what are things that are nice to have and help improve the profession, but aren't essential if under the regulatory side. Under the regulatory side, we're insulated. Not under the regulatory side, there's some can't think of the word, vulnerability, depending on how we set up the governance and the money. And so I think as we're thinking about that going forward, I think that's important to discern, but I believe that there would be ways with our creative thinking to set it up so that they would survive because of how it's established. And I'm not sure anyone exactly has what I'm kind of been playing around with in my head. So again, we would be a leader. And I am going now, I believe, to Andre next.
Dory had some
Oh, I'm sorry, Dory online, and then Andre. Thank you.
So I've pulled up onto the screen. Oh, it turns out there's a second one as well. This individual indicates that on the issue of antitrust, I think that the bar is opening itself up to lawsuits based on the fact that triple LTs and LPS are required to carry malpractice insurance, and yet attorneys are not. The issue is raised during the mandatory malpractice insurance task force, and I think should be considered.
All right, and I'm sure they meant LPOs, not LPCs, so that would be the limited legal license technicians and the limited practice officers. So that's a good observation. And the second one?
Kelly Deitman indicates that
Who was the first person? Did they identify
it's a
themselves?
numeric. The
All right.
individual.
I would ask that people who write in actually identify themselves so that we know who they are. If it's their WSBA number, we can find you, but I don't think it was. Go ahead, Tori.
This individual says, how do the work group members feel the Wsba is protected from antitrust litigation? Also, I agree with Hunter and Andre's comments. Thank you to Esperanza and Jane for speaking up for a large percentage of the Wsba members and the public. I agree with Jane for calling out the dues complaints. For comparison, as a private investigator, I pay $600 in license fees.
All right, Andre, you're next. I'm going to put myself back on the list again. I have one more comment.
Chief, if you want to make that comment now.
No, I'd like you to go. You're next.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, Esperanza and Jane, thank you for your comments. I think money and justice don't necessarily go hand in hand. One's relative and another one is elusive, oftentimes. I go one step further than calling or describing some of the individuals as immature. I think these grievances are legitimate in the fact that they want more bang for their buck, right? And what we're talking about is the practice of law, but not promotion of lawyers. And I think there may be a mistaken impression that the bar is here to promote lawyers singularly. And I think that is something we have to disavow, because one of the, in GR 12.1, one of the regulatory objectives, the first one is protection of the public. And so I heard conversations regarding a potential need to revisit GR 12. And I guess I put a question to the work group, is promotion of lawyers a part of that change to GR 12? Within GR 12, 12.1, there's also subsection C is the meaningful access to justice. Subsection 3 talks about diversity and inclusion. So Chief is right, as she often is, that some of this stuff is contained within the regulatory aspect and function of the bar already. So the question becomes, is there going to be a copycat suit that says compelled association related to diversity and inclusion is something that we really should worry about? And I've read these cases like Mark has, and I don't see anything really other than being a copycat idea coming our way. And so I think we have, again, a robust set of rules, one, a robust set of structures that are already in place, two, and I think that some of the opportunity to come at that, we can't prognosticate whether or not that's going to occur. In some of my readings, there is one litigation house that is doing the Texas, the North Dakota, right? So who's to say that because Washington is going through this structures work group that they're not going to come at us next? We can't know. And so while we would be mindful and making considerations regarding some of these landscape changes, we shouldn't make knee-jerk reactions, because we can't avoid. We shouldn't be making knee-jerk reactions, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we have 1 minute until our break. When we come back, I will call on Eileen. I just wanted to comment on the comment that it's important to hear from those who have dissenting views, and I think that's who we have been hearing from about bar dues and the things. But I think if we were to actually poll all 35,000 active members, many of them are happy to pay their dues and not think about us at all, other than to look at the back of the bar, the Northwest lawyer, to see who's been suspended or disbarred. And they're not on there, and they're okay. And then some get involved with the sections, and some get involved with committees, and some become sort of bar junkies, and the world starts to revolve around the people on the Board of Governors and the court and other people think everything is sort of revolving around us. Well, for the most part, I would guess 70 to 80% are happy to just have you take care of business, and they don't, and they want you to take care of business. They don't want to be having all the fuss. And if it turns out they have to pay less dues, fine. If they have to pay more dues, okay, not happy, but we'll do it. And so I think there have been some activities in the last 4 or 5 years that have made more people be a little more disgruntled or a little more attentive to what's going on or not going on at the bar, depending on one's perspective, but that by and large, they're happy that somebody is interested in taking care of it, and they just get to practice law or work with their firm or do what they're doing. And so we want to be relevant and we want to be value added, but there's also a part of us that is just regulatory, and that part continues. And then the rest, we want to be sure that we're being fiscally responsible, promoting our values, and going forward. And Andre, you mentioned GR12, but GR12, I would say, is a combination of both voluntary and mandatory. The practice of law definition would be really a little more definitive. I think the triple LTs coming on caused a lot of concern for many people. The referendum caused concern, different concern about the section money caused concern. I mean, there were like 2 or 3, 4 things might have all been prudent, good things to be talking about and discussing, but it caused or created situations where there could be more hubbub, not a good word, developed. And so I think part of it is tampering down that, or kind of having expectations as to what you can do and not do, and then the Board of Governors or whoever the governing body is, really disciplining themselves to stay on what their track is. And similarly, the executive director and the bar staff kind of people being in their lanes and knowing where their lanes are. And then maybe the Supreme Court has to have more involvement. Historically, we've been there when needed, and we recognize our role, and especially in the regulatory area. But for the most part, in my 35 years of being a bar member and many years in bar leadership, the Supreme Court wasn't interacting. When I was on the bar Board of Governor, which would have been in the 90s, I think I was bar president in 97, so mid-90s, we had a committee improving relationships with the Supreme Court because we didn't think we had any. We didn't have one. You know, sometimes, occasionally, the president would talk to the chief. Now, you know, I'm talking to him all the time. Not all the time as much lately, but when needed. And so I think it's just, and the Supreme Court doesn't really want to run the bar. I'll just say that. We've got full-time jobs. I joked a few months ago with the justices. I said, you know, I can run the bar if I have to. I just don't want to. I mean, this was before Tara came on, but when the wheels seemed to be coming off the wagon, it was like I actually felt I could with my experience, but that's not my job. That's not my role. And so I think we have to figure out how everybody can get where they go, and that we're communicating and interacting with our members so they recognize the value they're getting, or they understand they don't have to deal with it. So that should be worth the money all by itself. That things are just being taken care of without their involvement. So I would like to stop there. It's 10:34, so I would like you back at 10:49, a full 15 minutes. I'm going to write down 10:49, so I don't pull you back early this time. And Eileen will be the first to speak when we return. Thank you.